Hey, thanks for joining us. This is Bianca Bruno. I'm a reporter at Courthouse News, and I'm one of the co-hosts of Sidebar, our new podcast, and we are just getting started with a Twitter Spaces. Amanda, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. How are you doing, Bianca?
Good. I had to get my
now I can't hear you.
AirPods in. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. And this is
Okay.
Amanda Pampuro in Denver, Colorado.
So we're going to kick things off today. Last week we had our 10th episode, and Amanda took us to kind of the rural farmland, the pasture in Colorado, to talk about this very polarizing issue of wolves and basically the reintroduction of wolves in a state that has kind of competing interests regarding ranching and environmental concerns about preserving the species, right?
Absolutely.
So what struck me when you kicked off your segment was you kind of posed this theory of kind of how people feel about wolves in Colorado depends on if they think they're a threat. And so what kind of threat, do wolves actually pose in the state?
Absolutely. I kicked it off there because how you interact with wolves, your experience is going to influence your perception of them. And wolves are an apex predator. They're excellent hunters, and they're good at what they do, which is catching their prey and surviving. So these fears of wolves led to their extinction in the 20th century. Humans killed them on sight and hunted them out of extinction. And so when we look at reintroducing wolves, if you're not living in a rural community where you think you're going to be interacting with them, you probably are more supportive of bringing them back. And if you are in a rural community, you might be worried about wolf interactions. Now, there are very, very few wolf-human kills. I was looking up statistics to see how many documented kills there have been. According to Center for Human Carnivore Coexistence in Fort Collins, Colorado, there were no documented humans killed by wild wolves between 1900 and 2000. So that's 100 years, and people weren't killed by wild wolves. It's not necessarily human safety people are concerned about. It's more livestock, and livestock kills are also relatively low. It's about 1% of overall livestock that are killed. But if that's your livelihood and that's your sheep or your cow, you are going to feel that very deeply. And I just don't want to underplay what that means to people who have that experience.
Well, can you talk a bit about the history of state-sanctioned wolf hunting and how the Endangered Species Act factors in? Because wolves were reintroduced, a few decades ago, right, in the 1990s to Yellowstone. And so what did that look like, and how might that inform kind of reintroduction in other areas of the state?
Sure. So first I'll talk about Yellowstone, and then we can talk about some of the differences from state to state. I like to call the Yellowstone National Park, the reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone, an ecological fairy tale, because it's really the best case scenario of what people wanted to see. And everywhere is going to be complex and different, and we don't know if reintroducing wolves everywhere will have the same effect. But in the 1990s, Yellowstone didn't have wolves. They were eradicated in the 1900s. So there was no predator to keep deer and elk in check. And so they took over the park. They ate down the grass along riverbeds, which caused erosion. They would eat young saplings, so trees weren't growing back. There weren't places for birds to nest. And so you see ecological collapse. And then with the reintroduction of wolves, you start to see deer and elk aren't hanging out in the open. They're hanging out in trees. They're leaving the riverbeds alone. The grass is regrowing. Beavers come back, and there's a surge of biodiversity, and they attribute it to the wolves coming back. Again, Yellowstone is like the perfect example of that, and every environment is different. And putting the wolves in Yellowstone, which is in the northwest corner of Wyoming that overlaps with Montana and Idaho, also meant that wolves were going to disperse from there into other states. And last year, the wolves went from endangered to threatened under the Endangered Species Act. So now states are able to regulate their protections. Montana has actually been able to hunt wolves since 2011 because they had such a thriving population. And what's really interesting about Montana is that they sell permits every year to hunt wolves. And that money from selling wolf hunting permits pays for the population monitoring, and it pays to compensate ranchers whose livestock are killed by wolves. So there's an interesting little cycle there. And as I said, all states are different. So Wisconsin, their Department of Natural Resources has been using an emergency provision to allow wolf hunts, and that's being challenged right now by several Native American tribes. And that's an issue that we didn't really get to cover in the podcast that I think is also fascinating.
So, given that history, there was a state proposition last year, right? Proposition 114 that mandates Colorado reintroduce wolves by 2023. So, how does that vibe with their status kind of being, essentially delisted from the EPA? Or not the EPA, sorry. I'm going to talk about the EPA later. The Endangered Species Act, to be from endangered to threatened, but yet the state wants the wolves reintroduced. Kind of what is the status of that? What's happened with that in the past year?
Yeah, so the one thing that's interesting is that Colorado, it's illegal to hunt wolves in the state, even though there are very, very few right now. So there's local protections on that. Over the last year, the state has put together working groups and hosted public conversations to start moving. And there's a lot of questions to answer, like where are the wolves going to be imported from? Some places have brown wolves from Canada. Should we be bringing wolves from nearby Wyoming? Where do you put them that's going to give them wide open space and set them up for survival? How do you protect them? How do you protect the livestock? How much should ranchers be compensated? So the state is running through all of these complex questions and trying to develop a program that will allow wolves to successfully live beside humans in Colorado.
And so how do we reach this sort of, I think you posed the question in your segment, sort of a ideal symbiotic relationship between ranchers and wolves, where even though wolves do not pose much of a threat to people, especially, or much of a threat to livestock, there have still been, I believe, several laws introduced in Colorado in the past year regarding wolves in the state. And so what's kind of the status of that? How are conservationists kind of having a meeting of the minds with ranchers?
slow progress. Part of me, when I approached this, one of my questions in the back of my head was, should we be letting politics drive our conservation policy? Are different interest groups just distracting the conversation and making things more difficult? But speaking with a game manager in Montana, he pointed out that conservation management is inherently political, that you have people from different parts of society who have the different interaction and experience with these animals and different things at stake. So they come together to vie for that. And out of that comes what are our ecological priorities. Time will tell. I think Colorado is really interesting to watch because they're building their program from the ground up in this context and this awareness of what's happening in other states, what things are driving wolf protections and wolf hunts. So can you start from scratch and build something that works? That's something that a lot of people are going to be looking for over the next couple of years as the program continues to develop. And
is there anything that I didn't ask you or that didn't make it into your segment that you think is interesting that you're going to be looking at in your coverage going forward?
There are so many things that you can't squeeze into a little segment. I had to make a conscious decision to just focus on the gray wolves in the western United States, but we also have 2/3 of the wolves are in Alaska. And there's also the plight of the Mexican gray wolf down in New Mexico and the red wolf in North Carolina. So this is very much complex, wide, national thing to watch. Yeah.
Well, we'll be watching, and for those who are just joining, we are discussing our most recent Sidebar podcast where Amanda talked about wolves in Colorado and sort of the status of the reintroduction of the much contested predator there. And she's about to ask me some questions about an ongoing pollution problem at the border.
Absolutely. I loved your coverage of the Tijuana River. You put on your waders and you went out there and were splashing around. Tell me, let's start by talking about some of the pollution issues around the Tijuana River. Where's the sewage coming from? How are people in San Diego and how are people in Mexico being affected right now?
I don't know that I put on my waders. I wouldn't exactly go wading through the Tijuana River, but it is controversial because I think either a year or two ago, they actually opened a camping site like right in the middle of the Tijuana River. And so I can't say I'd go camping there either. But basically, it's a pollution problem that's existed for decades. It goes back as far as the 30s. And so I think it's kind of the perfect example of what I think environmentalists have pointed to, especially the past several years during the Trump administration with kind of the build the wall calls and border wall infrastructure, where environmentalists have continually raised concerns about the fact that borders are artificial, especially when it comes to environmental problems that encompass a region. And so San Diego and Tijuana are a border region that are both suffering from this problem that does stem in Mexico and transfers into the waters in San Diego. And so basically the water infrastructure in Mexico just isn't up to par with its population, which has steadily increased the past few decades, and it just has not kept up. And so either through storms in the rainy season, which is not very long in San Diego, obviously, in the Southern California region. There will be breaches of the border water infrastructure where it just doesn't ever get treated. And so it'll flow from Mexico into San Diego, which San Diego is it lies lower than Tijuana, and it'll flow into the valley through these tributaries and out to the Pacific Ocean and Imperial Beach, which is the southwesternmost beach in the United States. And it's just been an ongoing problem that really came to a head a few years ago with this massive breach during the rainy season in February 2017. And that's really kind of spurred the public attention on the issue for the past few years, which has obviously resulted in a significant amount of money from the federal government finally being allocated to hopefully plug the sewage problem, as I like to put in my coverage of this issue.
Totally. Plug it, and that's a good way to put it. And in recent years, a lawsuit was filed to try to address this problem. Who are the parties in the case, and what would a settlement do for the sewage problem?
So the lawsuit has definitely been paused, but it was filed in that year following the 2017 spill. So it was filed in 2018 by the state of California and several local cities, including Imperial Beach, which is the U.S. city most impacted directly by this pollution problem, where its beach has been closed for, hundreds of days at a time due to sewage contamination that's just, unsafe bacterial levels in the water. And so they sued over this spill in 2017, which likely dumped more than 200 million gallons of raw sewage in the Pacific Ocean. And at the time, the Imperial Beach Mayor, Serge Dedina, said it was likely the biggest spill that the region had ever seen. And while it was, an environmental catastrophe, it really posed a unique opportunity for local politicians in San Diego to really put pressure on the state, on its representatives at the state level, at the federal level, to do something about this problem. Because there's let me see how the best way to describe it. There is a government agency called the International Boundary and Water Commission, and there is a U.S. side and there is a Mexico side in Tijuana. And so they are the ones who operate this wastewater treatment plant just beyond the border in the U.S. that is kind of the first stopgap to treat any untreated water that flows from Mexico into the U.S. And that was built in the 90s. And basically, when it was built, it couldn't even it couldn't treat all the water that was flowing into the U.S. Its current capacity is 25 million gallons a day to treat. And when it went live, it wasn't even, there was more flow than it could treat back then. So they didn't build it big enough, even in the 90s. And the problem has only gotten worse as the population has increased the past few decades. So now, what were we talking about? We were talking about a lawsuit. So basically, the lawsuit is against that treatment plant and the International Boundary and Water Commission. And so the cities and the state are saying that this federal agency that is tasked with treating the wastewater that flows from Mexico into the U.S. hasn't done its job, and it hasn't done its job in violation of the Environmental Protection Act. And so that was filed a few years ago. It has been stayed after, there was announcement about the USMCA funding that we'll talk about in a little bit that's going to hopefully solve a lot of these problems. But a settlement would probably look like forcing the IBWC to improve its infrastructure, which will happen through some USMCA money, but it could, potentially go beyond that. And I think also require additional wastewater testing, a notification system, because that has been an issue where the two countries have been at odds when it comes to Mexico timely notifying the U.S. of a major breach. Like, it did not notify the U.S. of the 2017 breach that really spurred kind of the current discourse and political pressure regarding the issue.
And of course, nobody likes sewage. This seems like a issue where there's consensus that this is a problem and it needs to be solved. I'm sure people have been saying for years, we don't have the money, we don't have the ability to fix it. But the EPA recently announced $300 million are being allocated to support projects in the U.S. and Mexico. What projects are they building, and what impact do you think they'll have?
So they actually announced a couple weeks ago what projects are moving forward in the environmental review process, which will happen next year. And basically, all the proposed projects are on the table because they're really all needed to work together to really solve the sewage problem. And so the biggest one, and probably the most impactful one, will be to significantly increase the capacity of the U.S. wastewater treatment plant that we were discussing earlier. So it currently can only treat 25 million gallons a day, and it will be more than doubled to treat 60 million gallons a day. And so that's the highest priority project that will be completed first. But there are several other projects that will hopefully work in concert with that, including a couple on the U.S. or on the Mexico side of the border. They do also want to build an additional treatment plant in the U.S. They want to build some trash booms to collect trash and sediment that clogs our waterways, because sewage is not the only problem, although it's probably, it certainly is the one in the headlines and news coverage of this issue. But trash that flows through the valley and sediment is also a major concern. It's just not kind of the top level concern of the public health crisis when it comes to raw sewage. But that's something that will be addressed also. And then they want to build a small treatment plant. There's one currently. I don't think it's operational, or if it is, it's very shoddy. That's very close to the ocean in Mexico, because you've pointed out this doesn't just affect the U.S., it also affects Mexico. And so they've proposed another treatment plant for anything that kind of doesn't make its way through this other infrastructure to hopefully be caught before it makes its way to the Pacific Ocean. But, these projects they're all needed, and they're more than double the $300 million that's currently funded. So it's estimated to be upwards of $630 million to do all of that. And I anticipate in the next year or two, there will probably be more announcements of money to hopefully fully fund everything the EPA wants to accomplish with this, especially because there's political kind of will now that I don't think was there, 10 years ago. And there's certainly, if there's not political will, there's certainly political pressure related to this issue.
Nothing like letting things get worse to build up political pressure to get things done. But do you have a sense, you said the sewage plants built in the 90s already failed to meet capacity. So do you have a sense of whether these treatment plants being built now, is it to treat current demand, or will they be able to treat future growth and stress with climate change mixed in?
It is expected to keep up with population growth. I believe, let me check for you. I think through at least the next 30 years. Through 2050, it's expected to keep up with that, which kind of doesn't seem that long, right? Because the EPA gave the kind of a rough estimate of they hope these projects to be completed within this decade. They hope that it's completed by 2030. I think the wastewater treatment plant capacity project will probably be completed fairly quickly, and I think that's what everyone hopes makes the biggest difference, because it already exists, right? So they already went through initial environmental review and all these other kind of hurdles that it takes to do a project like this. And some of the other projects the EPA anticipates will take longer to get through, because they anticipate that environmental review process will be a lot longer to build new infrastructure in a region that has, environmentally sensitive habitat areas, and those types of concerns. So I do think it will make a big impact. I don't think it's a Band-Aid solution. I think it's just not clear exactly when that groundbreaking is going to happen, but the hope is probably within the next 2 years.
Cool. And with these decades-long infrastructure problems, people will believe in solutions when they see them. And as ground gets broken, that'll be awesome to continue following. We have just a couple of minutes left, but I did want to ask a little bit about the dynamics between the U.S. and Mexico. If we hadn't spent so long trying to build a wall between Mexico, would the infrastructure problems have been fixed faster? Is it just that Mexico doesn't have the cost or the ability to pay for their infrastructure on their side? What dynamics did you see?
In terms of those binational dynamics, I would say they don't have enough money to really build the type of infrastructure that's needed. There's also a lot of poverty in Tijuana. It's a border town where there's a lot of concern about basically, makeshift, unapproved homes and structures being built on the hillside, which overlooks the U.S.-Mexico border wall, and that, has no plumbing. It flows down into the river and into the U.S. during rain events, and there is concerns about that. And that's a political issue unique to Mexico that they will have to address. But in terms of their relationship with the U.S., the Surfrider Foundation has been very involved in this issue in terms of the water pollution crisis. And the woman I spoke to told me that it's been challenging. She's been working on this issue for basically 10 years. She's an Imperial Beach resident who was basically called to action because of the beach closures in her community related to pollution of the beach. And she said it's been challenging because they will make some headway with politicians in Mexico, but their government has a lot more turnover, a lot faster than in the U.S. And so, they'll kind of feel like they're making progress, and then someone will get out of office and there will be a new elected official, and then they have to rebuild those relationships. And so that's been something that's challenging, but and that's at the more local level. But I think this, because of the political pressure now, this is an issue that is being addressed nationally in Mexico. And there are a lot of EPA officials that have been in Mexico City in recent weeks, basically lobbying and discussing kind of the solutions with with this issue. And there's actually a press conference scheduled this afternoon that I'm covering for Courthouse News, where the U.S. ambassador to Mexico is going to announce some projects. So we'll see if it's actually a new announcement or what we kind of already know. But there does seem to be some headway being made that was not happening several years ago.
That's awesome. So there will be an update on the Tijuana River on courthousenews.com later today. I also know that we have Nicholas Iovino in California covering lawsuit over the wolves being delisted, and we have a reporter covering other issues that we've discussed. So all of that good stuff is on the website. And thank you to everyone who tuned in today.
Thanks for joining, and thanks, Amanda.
Bye.